loud.
In progress.
Okay. Well, we're not starting for 2 more minutes, so yeah. Dang, we already got 1 threat in the chat. The rest are going to be made by me. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Yeah. Okay. Hold on. If you have, this is just, yeah, because we still have people coming in. If you have questions, please drop them in the Zoom and not in the Discord, even though there is like a tutorial question category. And if you're comfortable, please make it a public question, just so there is a record of it and also other people know what we're answering. And you don't also don't have to just type the question. If you want to just unmute yourself and say it, or if you want to raise your hand and say it, which I believe is a Zoom functionality, like the fucking emotes thing. You can do that as well. And we'll just have like points where we will to say if anybody has a question, so you can ask there as well. Okay, once Ray's back in and a co-host again, we can probably start.
Yeah, Ray's here.
Okay, cool. Let me. Oh no, there's still people coming in. Okay.
Disable the
Yeah,
wait
we
room.
might want to wait a couple minutes since you just pinged the Discord.
Oh, you're correct. All right.
Do you want to disable waiting room?
The way I totally know how to do that.
I can just do it now.
Okay, go for it. Yeah, okay. Well then let's start at like 7:07 then. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Nope, it's still 7:06. I lied. Sorry. Okay, it is now 7:07. Yeah, so I guess we'll start. Welcome everyone. This is the game design tutorial for you guys. I know a lot of you guys are starting development teams, so hopefully this is useful when it comes to thinking about how to design your game and work around it. Cool. So first, of course, we have to give a definition of what is game design. Truly such a nebulous concept that no one knows what the fuck they're talking about. This is just a caveat, but there is honestly no one definition for game design. Game design is whatever you think it should be, to be honest. Of course, there are wrong answers. Like, you can't say, you know, I don't know, writing an algorithm is necessarily game design, even though it can be. But there's also no truly right answers. So here is just a definition that we came up with, which was that game design is essentially applying creative and interdisciplinary ideas in such a way that influences game and player decisions. And you'll see like this kind of like idea of influencing decisions and like that kind of stuff coming up a lot throughout this, you know, tutorial. So first, audience participation. There are a lot of types of game designers. Are there any that people can think of? Like off the top of your head. You can also make one up. There are truly so fucking many. I don't have points or money to give you, but not Todd Howard. He is certainly a person, capital P. Types of by types of game designers, I do not mean popular personalities. They are simply game designers. You cannot be a Todd Howard or a Kojima. That is not how this works. So I mean more so in like the different specs. Yes, thank you, Catherine, for giving a non-humanoid answer. Level designer is certainly one. Is there anything else that other people can think of? No, Ray, the fuck? I'm saying that you didn't give a person. Data structures. I don't know about that one, Johnny. Close enough. But yeah, any other ideas? Again, this is like very nebulous, so you can honestly throw out anything and it might honestly probably land. Mechanical designer? Yeah. UI for sure. Very interesting. Okay. Yeah, those are definitely some. So first, again, another caveat. Because game design is so interdisciplinary and broad, the categories that we have now are just to essentially help you guys get a better sense of how you might want to cater your design towards things you're interested in. But it's definitely not indicative of all the types of game design that exist. Like, for example, a new one that's coming up is you have a lot of VR designers, right? And that's something that you wouldn't have seen like even 10 years ago. So don't be disheartened if you're like, I'm not interested really in any of these, or I don't fall into any of these niches. Something out there exists for you. Cool.
Okay, and we're going to start with level designer, as Catherine mentioned. Essentially, level designers are people who design the environment of a game in a way that supports game mechanics and or player experiences. And even though the name is level designer, it does not mean that they just design levels. As mentioned below, they can also be responsible for hubs, pathing, and where or when events are placed. And this also does not mean the levels must be aesthetically pleasing when they are designing it, but rather they serve as design goals through like white boxing. They're often like prototypes that are not necessarily like pretty at the moment, but they show the game mechanics. And on the side, we also have a link to an example of how Dishonored 2 designers designed the Clockwork Mansion. And as these slides go on, there are also other links for each type of designer that you can look more into. Okay, and following that is system designer. And as the name suggests, they design systems. And we define systems as a group of elements that interact with other elements. And this is certainly not specific to video games. So system designers work on these elements and make sure that they have cohesive behaviors in the same group and that they work toward the same goal. Some examples of systems that system designers need to work on are in-game economies and crafting systems.
The cursed monetization. Anyways.
Oh, yeah, and another type of designer is like AI designer. So they don't necessarily focus on the field of AI, but they design behaviors that like in-game entities have, things like that. And these behaviors are ideally as reasonable or believable and readable or actionable as possible. And this often means requires designing how entities react to the way the player behaves Like if you slice an NPC, they might like scream or something, I don't know. And a subclass of AI designers is like entity designer. Yeah, and the example on the side is how like the horses of Red Dead Redemption 2 are believable, made by AI designers. And another type of designer is like class or character designer. So where like the AI designer deals with in-game objects, class or character designers designs around the player. And they're responsible for creating thematic groups of systems or abilities to further some kind of player fantasy. And they give basic guidance to how this thematic design might look or sound, but they do not create it. And I think someone also mentioned UI, UX designer when we asked what types of designers there are. And yes, they're a type of designer, and they design ways to basically convey information without breaking immersion in the game. And a lot of thought is put into designing around how the player behaves and interacts with visuals. And sometimes UI, UX isn't even visuals you can see on the screen, but they design the hierarchy of visual information given to the player, and also includes like kind of how like processes happen and how to make it like a good experience in general, because it's user experience as well. Yes.
Yeah, so next we've got narrative designers. So narrative designers, contrary to the image you may have in your head when you think narrative, are not necessarily limited to concrete text and or dialogue. Narrative designers are more broadly concerned with the connection between game objects, whether that be like items, specific locations or environments, and of course like the characters in the world, with the story as a whole. So their job is kind of to leave a touch on every element of the game that they can in order to bring it all together into one like cohesive moving narrative that the player doesn't just read technically, but like experiences holistically within the game. We've got like this, there's like an entire book here on just video game storytelling and what that entails. And then we do have like a link to some like astounding dialogue right there as well. And I think there was a question in the chat.
Yeah, I can take that. Yeah, just to like piggyback a little bit off of what Maud was saying. A lot of like what we're saying here about these designers is less like being like, this is what they do, and more so like, these are some things that you might not think that they're responsible for, but they are. And a lot of people will confuse a narrative designer with like a game writer, right? Where they're like, oh, I'm the one, you know, writing out the overarching plot of Dragon Age Inquisition. When in reality, it's not necessarily like that. And you'll see like very famously in the video that I linked, like how narrative designers essentially worked around Hades. Yes, need to plug Dragon Age for Zoe. Yeah, and to answer your question, Calvin, let me go back onto this slide. UI hierarchy is definitely a part of it is, you know, like how info is prioritized for the player. An example of this is like menus and submenus. In a game, like hypothetically, like, wow, you have a very intensive crafting system, but if that crafting system was shown to you constantly, you wouldn't really be able to play the game, like the core game. So you'll see a lot of like UI UX designers focused on making sure the user experience is immersive when it needs to be. And you won't see that crafting menu until you start crafting. So that's like that kind of information hierarchy where they'll have screens that they won't show you, visuals that they won't show you until you need to see it and it's topical. And they decide how that works.
Cool. So hopping back into narrative, there's actually so much to do in narrative design. We're going to mention like two distinct subclasses, one of them being quest design. So quests in general are you can think of them as like microcosm pockets of a game where you can explore in more intimate details the themes, characters, or like totally separate subplots and side stories in the world. Which in the end give the player some form of like immediate reward. So quests are extremely tangible in nature. It's an in the moment process built within the game that the players are aware of as they're put through it and have proof of in the form of some kind of like compensation at the end. And like some examples would be like this kind of like core loop format that you see where it's kind of like you enter this area to get payout and you either get some form of reward in the form of a new area or maybe things to upgrade your character or abilities so that you can like keep going forward.
Again, to piggyback, sorry. But yeah, like in game design, you'll hear like the buzzword feedback loop tossed around a lot. And like what Mob was saying, a quest is truly one of the like most endemic examples of that. So, fun fact.
Yes. And then on the other hand of that, like totally other end of the spectrum is more of world design. So if quests are like the microcosms of the game, the world is like the entire additive expanse of the space that the game takes up. It's a lot more vague. It's always there, but it's not experienced as firsthand as quests. World is more concerned with giving the player like and the surrounding rules that they function in, like the surrounding environment that they function in, giving that one rules and limitations as to what can and cannot happen. And that specifically contributes to like the feeling of immersion, specifically through consistency in those rules. So this immersion, I'm sure you all know, is one of the biggest factors that can draw a player into the game. And so make its narrative as well as like all of its other aspects a lot more powerful. And there's like, as you can see, we have a link to like world design for different player types even. So there's like lots of different ways that you can go with world building, as it is like kind of like the foundation that you would build almost everything else out of.
And another type of designer that we would like to mention is like the technical designer. And they often act as the bridge between creative and technical designs in game design. And not only do they focus on the logic of creative designs, they are often also responsible for the technical architecture of that design as well, such as maybe creating like software tools for people to use on teams and things like that. And yeah, so a type of designer that not a lot of people might think of like right off the top of their heads, but they're very important.
Cool. I keep on forgetting that I muted. Sorry. Do you want to say something?
I was just gonna go into it.
Go for it.
Okay, yeah. So from here on out, we're gonna go over some like common misconceptions just about game design in general, what it entails, what it means, how it works. And we wanted to ask, like, what do you guys think some common misconceptions by people are? Like, what do you think people misunderstand about design as a whole? Maybe it's even something that like you learned after participating into ACM, like something that you had wrong in the beginning and that you've learned from that experience.
Feel free to guess anything. You
Yeah.
won't get real life points, but you will get brownie points.
You'll get hype points from Athena.
No, ew.
Yeah, so like what is just kind of like, what do you think the most common misconceptions are about game design? And that can be from your own experience or just complete hearsay. So Praksha said Praksha said you don't need to be able to code to participate. That's interesting.
Johnny says, who cares about game design?
Yeah, we're gonna ignore
Hurts
Johnny.
me. That hurts me. That hurts me just a tad. It's fine though.
Yes. Initial game design aligning with end product. That's a good one too. Graphics are more relevant to a game's success and the game being fun. Different aspects of design are very disjointed.
Very good.
All
yeah.
very sexy answers.
Indeed.
So yeah, if you guys think of any more, drop them down. But we can go into some of the ones that we specifically wanted to highlight here, I think. So one of the bigger ones is valuing intention over execution. So a lot of the times when you come up with something really cool that you think creates a certain mood, reflects a theme, or overall like enhances the game that you want to make to a certain extent, you'd want to cling to that function. But in game dev, it's so fluid. You want to cling to the reaction rather than the catalyst. So you want to focus on more of what you want to come out of the design rather than the design itself. So like due to how fluid the development is, focusing on intention over execution like means that your core experience stays aligned and like specifically thematic. Whereas if you don't budge on execution, it runs the risk of your design becoming out of sync with the final direction of the game. And so I think that's part of what Christian mentioned earlier with like the initial game design aligning with end product. If you stick to this execution state of mind, like it's going to end up being more disjointed and not as cohesive in the end as if you focus more on the intentions. So examples of intentions include readability, ease of access, like we mentioned, like thematic use and like impact that you'd want to make. Whereas executions are those like tangible things like colors, fonts, environments, and like hard-coded specific abilities. Another big one is keeping an audience perspective. So when you're caught up in like the experience and like the fun parts of making a game, it can kind of be easy to forget that technically the game that you're making isn't for you. It's for the players and people who will eventually end up playing it as like a totally new experience. And understanding the kind of audience you want to target with your game can actually be critical in how it affects every other aspect of the design choices that you make moving forward with it. So in game design, there's what's known as this like Bartle taxonomy of player types. You can see this is what that kind of little chart is over on the right. It's like, are your players killers, achievers, socializers, explorers? So they're very simple generalizations, but learning to keep one or two in mind as you go through development can help hone your game's like purpose and also increase its effectiveness within an entire community rather than like a few isolated individuals. And so what we're really trying to emphasize is like building a game that resonates with an audience requires this audience perspective by making it. And then we wanted to mention Quantic Foundry had a kind of gamer motivation investigation and a talk about like what came out of that was really popular and very valuable for like when you're thinking about people eventually playing your game and like how you can cater to them, their needs and their wants.
Yeah, also the quiz that Johnny links essentially is, if you take it, it'll do like an analysis on the kind of player that you are. Yeah, and then there's a question by Preksha, tell me if I pronounced that correctly, sorry, in the chat that they're asking, what does the player type, like quote unquote player on the chart mean? Like sort of the axes.
Yeah, so the axes, the players part of the axes specifically is kind of the players who play with other people. So like playing as a team, that's the thing that killers and socializers have in common is usually that they are playing with like other in like multi-game situations, whereas achievers and explorers prefer like solo games, which is like the Warwick, like they're going out on their own to war kind of a thing terminology. So yeah, it just depends on really that like whether or not it is multiplayer or like solo playing. Yes. There's like lots more we could talk about like with these specific player categories, but I think rather than like knowing specifically what they are right now, we wanted to emphasize like just keeping like things that are out there that you can use to think about audience as you're making your game.
Yeah, and then Richard also asked, what if your target audience is yourself? Would you like to answer this, Mom, or I can also answer it?
You can answer it, go ahead.
For sure. So that's like definitely a valid thing as well, if your like target audience is yourself. But I would argue at that point, the design doesn't necessarily matter, because you know what you like, like you know what you like, you know what you want to play, you know the kind of things that you want to see. So regardless of how like polished or flawless or seamlessly integrated they are, it doesn't matter because it's for you. And that's like definitely a very valid way to design things. But at the same time, that also means that if you show them to other people, they might not have the same reaction. And so keeping an audience perspective, essentially saying to prepare yourself for when that happens, also why that might happen. Yeah, and Faustine, what Faustine said, which is like people can inherently have an audience perspective you design for yourself, is also very valid as well.
Yeah, and especially if you like consider yourself part of like a certain player community, that could be a way where like it's not so much you're like using your personal preferences, but like the styles that you know that you enjoy and like the rest of your kind of like fellow gamers also enjoy, and using that to influence is perfectly valid. Alrighty, so this one, I think the misunderstanding, it stems from the idea that like some aspects of game design team are like more critical than others, which is in fact very removed from the truth. Each member of a design team, like as you saw, there are so many different kinds of designers. It's never just one person. And each member on a design team has like strengths and capabilities, but like the game that isn't really like going to be truly realized until they all come together. So when working in game design, you're never going to be working in solitude, nor will you have full control over everything you touch, and like that is okay. Listening to the people around you and like the ones that will be eventually on your team, and integrating yourself as one of many is kind of the only way you can really approach design without losing your mind, I feel, because if you're kind of like obsessed with your own role in the bigger picture and like making sure that some of your work is like there, or like your influence is in there, then you kind of like lose like part of the perspective that is working with so many diverse people, listening and being open to like good ideas that we say like can come from literally anywhere.
Yeah, and just to add on to this like a little bit, I know like some people are thinking, well, what about the person who made Stardew Valley or Undertale or like that kind of stuff, because they're singular individuals. The story that's not quite there is that it took those people like a literal decade to get that game out. It's incredibly difficult to be an indie developer, and oftentimes it's because you don't have these other people to fall back on to help you do these kinds of things. Yeah.
So similarly, I think it's also critical to understand design as an interdisciplinary art. I'm sure some of you being part of studio for however long that you have, you've already noticed the kind of diverse talents that are brought together throughout the whole game development process. But designers are in an even kind of more unique position, given that gaining a firmer understanding of each of the different disciplines will enhance their own ability to exercise their own skill to a greater effect. So like a great example that we have here is if you're a combat designer, but you're unaware of the nature of animation and framing, it can lead to a misunderstanding of like light versus heavy attacks and affect the overall feel of the combat, despite the fact that you are the combat designer, because you lack that knowledge of animation, which is technically not your department, but it affects you. So designers have so many of these kinds of like mini connections and links with so many other dev departments. Like these kinds of examples can be really found throughout like almost every design aspect. In a sense, it's easy to compare a game designer to like a jack of all trades, and the fact that they have knowledge of all, master of none, except they kind of become the master of all through like their knowledge of all, if that makes any sense at all. But just like keeping in mind like the interconnectedness. I think someone mentioned that like certain game parts of game dev are like disjointed is a big misconception, and that is true. And I think that's what this speaks on.
Yeah, I'd also like to talk about what Precious said with another misconception, which is like you don't need to be able to code to participate. It's like definitely true. Like no one is saying that to be a game designer, you have to be a master coder, know exactly how to 3D model and animate or anything like that. But understanding, you know, like how to talk, you know, like a 3D animator would, or like just basic, you know, programming logic, it helps a lot when it comes to designing the things that you need to.
Yeah, speaking from someone who cannot code or do art to save their life. Very true.
Cool. Now, okay, we're going to talk about building from a concept, which I'm sure is what a lot of you are here for. How exactly do you take something from the idea stage to the finished product stage? Is there anything that anybody can think of that either, you know, A, helped them when they were doing stuff like this, or if you don't have that experience yet or you don't quite know, anything you can think of that you think would help bring something from like an idea stage to a finished product stage? Well, yeah, keeping expectations realistic, just trying things, both definitely very valid. Yeah. I also like how they're both on opposite ends of the trying things spectrum. Definitely. Anything else? Cool. That's cool. Those two things are, oh yeah, loss of communication as well. Very, very true. Definitely. All very, very valid. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about, you know, how exactly we go about doing this. So first of all, brainstorming. Like I believe Jeffrey said, you can just try things. You don't want to be critical of these kinds of things because you guys are still in the beginning stages. Put your fingers in as many pots as possible. And see what kind of comes out from that. One thing that you do need to do is you need to make sure that you are recording the things that you are thinking of, because if you don't and you lose it later on, then, you know, like, what are you going to do? How are you going to find it? So definitely it's two parts, right? Is being as open as possible, but also recording all of the things that you're thinking about. You can do this through like mind maps. You saw before, there's like a lot of those like flow charts that we showed in those images. That's also fine. Honestly, pencil paper also works. And the final thing is like talking about it with your team, you know, like talking about it with other people, right? Maybe somebody else will think of something that you couldn't have thought of because it's, you know, a different perspective. And that's all super important when it comes to this kind of like brainstorming aspect of this. So this is how you kind of get your initial idea, one that you know is like strong and you can iterate on. And then next, there's like a bunch of different ways to really build off of this concept. You usually, it's always best to start with a small central idea. Then you can dive in deeper because that way you can keep things thematic. You know, if something's starting to go off course, you can always refer back to the central idea if you need to, you know, like make sure that, you know, things are going the way that the game is supposed to go or how you envision the game is supposed to go. And then there's also like quite a few ways that people kind of approach this. Again, I just want to preface by saying this is not like a right/wrong way of doing this. This is simply the perspectives that people have when they start to build off of ideas. Some people look at it mechanically. I'm a very mechanically, system-based designer, where I will think, oh, these are interesting systems that can come into play. How do we iterate? How do we make another system that plays well off of that one? That's the way that, some people will think about it. And that's a way that you can start to build off of some core concepts. Another way is like narratively, right? Some people like to be like, wouldn't it be cool if we had a story that was like this, if we had like a mood that was like this, or tone or something like that, right? This is an example is like people who are like, oh, I want to make a horror game that does this and this. That's like a very narrative way to build something, because there's no core concrete thing that you can just slap into production and like, have it work. But both very valid ways of thinking about it. So if you find yourself thinking one way or another, don't be like, oh shoot, I'm thinking about it in a wrong way. It's just one way to build off of a concept. And these are some questions that we have on the slide to essentially help you think more in that specific niche, whichever your niche is. And then finally, this is like when you've gotten your core idea, you've started building some concepts off of it. Now it's kind of like thinking about how the design might interact with other things, right? If you want a horror game, what does that mean now when it comes to programming? What does that mean when it comes to like visuals? Do you want it to be like super dark and oppressive, or do you want it to be almost like uncannily bright and like vibrant, right? These are things that you need to think about, and this oftentimes just means like thinking about it in terms of other aspects of game development, right? I was talking about how it looks visually, how does it work technically, and finally it's also thinking about how it works when it comes to the player, right? How will the player interpret these things? And you can sort of build more concrete tasks off of this. If you want the player to be scared at a specific moment, you can turn that into like a very tangible task, right? Just like you can turn visual palettes or certain, like programming or like movement, cycles. And yeah. And then finally, you have your ideas, your core concepts, you've set out all of these tasks. How do you combine them in the end? And I think combining them is very much like a thought process than just physically connecting like a bunch of nodes and puzzle pieces. It's again, keeping in mind like common goals, making sure you take input from your team. If somebody is like, oh, you can't really add this feasibly because we're going to have to refactor all of our code, maybe thinking about designing around that. And asking questions about your like to yourself or to other people, maybe play testers, and just make sure that things kind of follow the same kind of intention that you had at the beginning, and that's how you can make sure your scope stays consistent, right? Because you don't try like 10 million new things when you only have like 2 weeks left. But it just also helps like lead your thoughts and like your brainstorming, because you'll be brainstorming inevitably throughout this whole process. So hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully that helps a little bit with how you should be thinking about design throughout this whole process, because design doesn't stop once the game idea is out there. It definitely continues through the whole process, and hopefully this helps. And then the last thing, you might have seen this word very recently, especially team leads, which is a game design document. The stuff that's written here might be an antithesis to the way that you had to do your game design document, which was like about the whole game. But having something written out keeps you accountable and like helps you remember and retain the sort of design intentions of any specific thing. So these often include a player story. A player story is essentially a sentence where it's like, if I was a player, I would be doing X at Y. Core gameplay loops, anything that you need. If I want to implement a system, what do I need visually? What do I need programming wise? Do you need to put any references so that other members of your team know exactly what's going on in your head? And also, this is also very important, a measure of success. At what point is your game design document successful? At what point have you successfully executed on your design. Having a small sentence that says exactly where that benchmark is very helpful to like stop you from being like, oh, I mean, like, I think this works, let's just keep going. And also, it's also very helpful to keep them small and centralized. Again, I know that some of y'all's GDDs are like 10 pages long, that's fine. But if you want to do these as like, you know, you're iterating throughout like these 6 months, if you're on like a development team, making sure they're small will help you process how things are supposed to go. So yeah, hopefully that helps. Oh shoot, I shouldn't be here yet, my bad. Well, that was a spoiler. But yeah, hopefully that helps. If you guys have any more questions about this exact process, just drop the questions in the chat. But now we're gonna hop into the next part, which is, now that we've talked about, you know, how this, you know, pipeline might go, are there any ideas from, you know, everybody watching about some different philosophies of game design that could also help as you're building your game? TLDR, any philosophies of game design that you guys want to drop in the chat that you know of or that you think exist? I spoiled it a little bit, I'm sorry. Not the Todd Howard. What is it with you and Todd Howard? My guy. Yeah. The Bethesda framework. Indeed. Somebody else, who dropped Kojima? The Bethesda philosophy, indeed. No, stop, Johnny. That's not an invitation. Indeed. Form follows function. Indeed. Awesome. Okay, so we're gonna move on because I'm now being made fun of in the chat. Just a person, no one else model. What do you mean by that, Johnny?
Okay, too slow typing. Just making a joke. If you read
Okay.
off the capitals, Japanese games always like seem they are designed by a single person.
I understand what you mean. It's like they target one individual, no like accessibility design, like that kind of vibe.
Yep.
Yeah, definitely. Not to shade JRPGs, but definitely. Cool. Well, we're gonna move into some of the examples that we have. Again, not indicative of everything that exists, but could be helpful for how you want to work on your games.
Yeah, essentially some ways for us to approach design and applying them. And like the first one that we have is top-down design, which is a pretty specific method of breaking down a game concept. So the steps for it is basically you start from a really large concept and then you proceed by breaking it down into various sections, eventually creating a specific task. Tasks. And the image here shows a way of like how top-down design might be applied to, say, building a house. It will be split into like foundation, exterior, inside, and they'll be further split into different things. And another type of design philosophy is called Emergent Design. Essentially, you will be designing open-ended and thematic mechanics and systems that will interact with each other. And when this happens, gameplays that are very interesting might emerge. And examples of that is in Far Cry 4, players might initiate tigers versus gang fights because of how the AI is designed. And in Breath of the Wild, some like emergent gameplay happens based on how fire interacts with burnable things and how rain just extinguishes fire and makes walls and things and slippery and things like that. And how that is approached is basically in the middle, there is a type of stimulus that things are related to, and NPCs, AIs will react to that. Yeah, and that's like a type of emergent design. Yeah. Okay. Another design philosophy is to follow the fun. Basically, people make a lot of prototypes, and through play testing, identify the fun elements of the game, and the game will be the gameplay will maximize and build around the fun elements. An example of this is Ape Out, which started as a time looping stealth game with like guns and things like that. But after playtesting, people were more interested in using melee attacks and attacking the guards. So it turned into just an ape game. And it was very innovated by following the fun. Yeah. Okay. And another important design philosophy that can be used in all games is probably necessary is to design for accessibility. It's very important that your game reaches the most number of people possible, regardless of ability or disability. And we're going to publish some bite-sized tutorials on how to approach that.
Keep on forgetting I'm muted. Anyways, yeah, and now that we've like kind of rambled about all of these different types of design, how you can go about doing these things, I have cursed, Peter. What of it? We're gonna look at some case studies and see if we can apply, you know, like what we just said, to some actual real life things.
Yeah, so I think looking at game design through case studies is really helpful because it can be really intimidating to like start from nothing and then build stuff out. But if you're looking at something from that's already built and you start picking apart the pieces, you can kind of start to think more critically about how they were put together, and that can really help like sharpen your thought process when you're doing it yourself. So one of the ways that we're going to do that is by looking at games that are like technically the same genre, but whose designs express it in dramatically different ways. So we want to think about exactly what contributes to the game's impact. In this case, asking what, apart from it's a horror game, makes these games scary. So we're going to ask y'all to perhaps brainstorm some different qualities of these three games that contribute to their role as horror, but also like the kind of impact that they make, and like what design choices specifically enhanced the game's impact. Monica, yes, that's like character is one thing, because you know Doki Doki is so heavily centered around at least the horror aspects. Monica, who she is, her relationship to the world, whereas like and the playable character, whereas in something like spoilers, no, whereas in something like Little Nightmares, your character is very mitigated in importance. Yeah, Calvin, how did you even do that? Awesome.
Also, if you don't know like one or two of these games, that's okay. You can just talk about the game that you know.
Yes, we're not connecting them yet, just trying to think about them and understand their individual elements separately, and then after that, then you can just hang out. If you don't know
Watch
any
a
of
trailer
them,
right now.
I'm
Yes.
sorry. I know they're like, it's like two really obscure ones and then one somewhat popular one. I'm just so out of the loop. This is my fault. Do you know?
You can also just say any horror game, you know, because like then we can also compare them against what we have here, and you can see how what we thought of differed.
Ray is exposing me for being obsessed with Little Nightmares.
That shit baller.
It's so
Taste.
good. It's so good. Thank you, Faustine. But yeah, anything else? Any like elements of horror games that you think that have impacted you in the past, scared you in the past? Like what kind of design choices do horror game producers choose? Environment. Yes. Color. Yes. Love that. And you can see, even through these pictures, the environment and colors are very different of these games, and yet they're all very scary. Taking power away from the player. Yes, power in the form of action, but also knowledge. Taking away the player's knowledge of what's happening is also a good one. Five Nights at Freddy's is terrifying. Limited resources, that's a good one too. Contrast, innocent kitty stuff with morbid themes, yes. That use of contrast more broadly as well can be used in so many different ways, and definitely makes things unnerving. Limited sight range, yeah.
Okay,
Surprise.
Lighting.
Lighting.
Really turn off my flashlight? I would pee myself.
Yeah, no, like limited. I feel like that like, and you can see those two kind of connecting. Like if you have limited sight and limited light at the same time, jump scares. Yes. No, it's seriously it. I can't play horror games that have jump scares because I'll literally lose my mind. That is the most scary. That's the scariest thing of all, Kelvin. Awesome. You guys are great.
Okay, do you want me to
Yes.
reveal? Okay.
The magic reveal. We're magicians.
Oh shit. How do I get out of okay.
I could also do it. I can also just do it. Do you want me to do it?
It's okay, I got it.
Okay.
Okay. We made the text white because we don't know how to do slide transitions.
So yeah, so everything you guys mentioned was great and beautiful. Thank you, Kevin. We do our best here. But we just, for your convenience, listed out some of the attributes that you can kind of like see how they are like connected in the fact that it's like, okay, dialogue, like whether or not that's present, whether or not that's emphasized, the kind of specific emotion that the games bring out, like in Little Nightmares, it's like this growing feeling of dread, versus in DDLC, it's like a sudden complete 180 where you're like kind of thrown into the fires, whereas in Dead by Daylight, it's just kind of like using iconic imagery and things that are inherently fear-inducing just because of like the society that we're in. And so you can see how like these games that are all so different are still kind of manipulating the same things in order to get a certain reaction out of their players. Explicitly, like another one I think nobody mentioned was like the pace of the game, like how fast versus how slow it is. Little Nightmares is an extremely slow, agonizing experience, where Dead by Daylight is extremely like frantic and more adrenaline inducing. Like general like manipulating themes of like whether it's more monster horror or human nature horror, and that can also be connected to an example of like intention that we talked about earlier. So all of these games technically have the same kind of intention, and that is to scare the player, but it's through these different methods and mechanics that they actually execute it, and that is what we mean by like execution.
Cool. We're going to look at another case study, which is essentially two games that are very similar to each other, but one did very, very well, and the other one did very, very, very poorly. Let's ignore the, as Calvin called it, the Todd Howard philosophy. Let's ignore that part. So let's ignore the bugs of Fallout 76. And indeed, it just works. But yeah, are there, if you haven't played one or the other, please just like feel free to just comment on one. But in your guys' opinion, what's the reason that, you know, either Fallout 76 failed or Outer Worlds succeeded? It can also be vice versa, to be honest. If you guys like want, if you think Fallout 76 is very good and then Outer Worlds is very trash, I mean, I'd love to hear your opinion on that too. One of them doesn't have any NPCs. Okay. Johnny, please specify for the crowd. Just because I'm sure there are people who haven't played one or the other. But also that is very true. For those who don't know, Fallout 76 and Outer Worlds are both considered, like RPGs, like especially like open world RPGs. And sometimes, people will say they didn't like Fallout 76 because despite it being a role-playing game, they didn't have anyone to contextualize their role with. Interactions felt very flat, which also means your role in the game feels very flat. Cool. Anything else? Oh, also, my bad, to give the comparison, because I should probably do that. By contrast, Outer Worlds has specific characters with specific side storylines that will expand abilities and not just their story, and contextualize whole areas, and along with that influence the ending. So to some players playing Outer Worlds and choosing which companions you wanted to be closer with than others, and seeing how that impacted the world around them, made the game feel very much like an RPG and made their actions seem very impactful. Anything else? It's okay if the answer is nothing. That's fine. Interesting look of Outer Worlds environment. That's true. That's true as well. Like even just in the images that I have taken, the one on the bottom, I believe, was Bethesda at E3, which is supposed to be, like the big gameplay showcase. And even then, the colors seem like a lot more desaturated than Outer Worlds. And that can cause a player to lose interest in the world that you have and make them not want to play your open world if you don't have anything that really catches their eye. So yeah, that's definitely true as well. Cool. So I am, hold on, I need to, hold on. My bad. I am actually not going to give you guys the answers because this is not an answer sort of thing, but I will instead give you guys some questions to think about what might have set these two games apart and why that might have mattered. So, when should decisions matter in games like this? What is the balance of combat versus narrative? And especially immersion and retention. If your game is 60 hours long and you want players to care about their role, how do you do that? And when does it fail and succeed? Cool. Okay, finally, these are some action item questions. These are questions not pulled straight out of popular interviews, but very similar in the sense that, if you want to be a game designer, if you, want to think the way that maybe some current game designers, in the industry think, these might be good reference points or good things to critically think about. We're not gonna go through and answer these. These are kind of like the side quest or like after the tutorial things that you guys can think about. But they're good to keep in mind. So some of these include like thinking of different ways to end a scenario. How do you break apart certain abilities? Why do certain problems arise in design? But yeah, we'll link this slide deck, so just feel free to think about these in your own time. Oh yes, and then finally, here are some classes to take if you want to do more design stuff. Mob, do you want to take this? Because
yeah,
okay,
I will.
go for it.
UCLA is not, truthfully, not the best at providing coursework for game design. However, we manage. And the way that we do that is by branching out. So they don't have like a whole game design department like some other universities do, but honestly, it's kind of interesting because that's just kind of like you see these different gaming classes popping up in all these kinds of different majors, and kind of like is showing you need to branch out in order to get involved in this disciplinary art. So these are 2 English courses. I've taken M133 myself. It was amazing. I'm in M138 right now. I'm a professional writing minor. So these are like kind of upper division classes. But like if you're end up in your junior or senior year, you have those like earlier past privileges and you're interested. The English department does semi-frequently in a year put out a gaming course class, so just keep an eyes out for those. We've got some notorious DESMA courses. Unfortunately, Faustine is an aspiring DESMA major, trying to get the rights to take these classes. They are interesting, but they are pretty exclusive. But then there's like this entire design in the theater entertainment program, actually, where you can learn so many different like actual programs. If you wanted to mention a couple of the ones that you thought were the most, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, always TFT gets all the good shit, and us other students are left with the scraps, as always. But yeah, like they teach you like AutoCAD, Maya, if you want to do like 3D stuff. There are Unreal and Unity courses as well. They do like, like scenic, like a lot of like environmental scenic design, but also stuff that is like, I believe it's like computer design shit. But yeah, like you can literally search up TFT design for theater and entertainment program and it'll just show you the whole list of classes there. Those are less exclusive than DESMA.
Yes, I was gonna say those are more open. And there's actually a lot more of them. So yeah.
Okay, and as a conclusion for all of this, just you can play more games, you can like research all this theory, you can understand more disciplines, and you can definitely see how others did it. In the slides, we've linked like a bunch of videos, a bunch of GDC talks. You can think of or look up more case studies as well. But like the final takeaway should be that good game design can be learned. It is not something that you are born with. If you don't have the kind of like logic or thought process right now, do not despair. Good game design is always learned. It is never just innate. Yeah, talent is an illusion. Say it. No,
yes. I'll say it. Talent is an illusion.
But yeah, so please don't be discouraged. And if you guys are interested or have any more questions about this, feel free to just pop it in one of the tutorial channels, or just ask somebody. It's simply just like a way of thinking. Yeah, that's it.
That's it.
Yeah. We hope you guys have enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you for coming.
Yeah. Let me link this actually real quick.
Oh, we got the slides.
Yeah. Hold on. And copy it. Yeah, thank you guys for coming. If you guys have any more questions, feel free to ask. There's technically still another 53 minutes of this. Technically. Yeah, we hope you guys like that.
Guys, I've been fighting a food coma for like an hour. I don't know how I'm awake right now. I'm not gonna lie.
Don't fight it. Go to sleep.
What did you
but there are
consume?
clothes on my bed.
Thanks for coming.
I DoorDashed some sujita.
Bro, is it so good?
Yeah. It's honestly good because you can reheat like when like the soup already gets cold like natural. Like if you eat at Sujita, like that shit cools off really fast anyways. So it's like honestly not that different.
Interesting.
Plus you could like I could like microwave the soup again if I wanted to, but I was lazy. sustenance.
If Christian just goes to sleep now, will
Dude, no.
will bad things happen to him during sleep?
Why is Christian always in a
Right.
constant fate of? Yeah, I'm either starving or in a food coma. There's like no in between.
It's
It's
still
still recording.
Uh-huh.
Who's gonna edit
Nice.
this? Lol.
I
Bro,
see.
Peter eats so fast. If he's
How do we
faster than
stop
me, I
recording
think
now?
that's a good
Yeah.
compliment.
I'm editing.
I can edit. I can edit.
Okay,
Peter.
should I stop
I
recording?
Yeah,
volunteer,
stop it.
Mom.
Stop it.
Yes.